As Rilke said, we don't have much knowledge yet in grief. So this massive darkness makes us small. And so in some ways, our not having practices to move through grief keeps our lives small. I consider grief a threshold emotion. In other words, when we step across that threshold and enter the room of grief, it has a way of opening up the rest of our life. We enter the hall then of community, joy. Even William Blake said, the deeper the sorrow, the greater the joy. When we compress the terrain of grief, we also compress the territory of joy, and we end up living in a flatline culture, which is where we are right now. And then when you live in a flatline culture, you rely upon stimulation and stimulants to give you some sense of being alive, because we're not experiencing genuine joy, nor are we expressing genuine grief. So these practices become what I call soul hygiene. We know how to take care of our teeth and our hair and our body. We exercise. Those are all hygiene practices, but we forgot about the hygiene of the soul. And to clear out the soul regularly with practices around grief is an absolute necessity. Denise Levertov had a little sweet poem. She said, "To speak of sorrow works upon it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall." So these practices become ways of maintaining a relationship to our own soulful life, but also then to the soul of the world. If we don't practice those things, we become more isolated and more disconnected. We are conditioned in a heroic culture to do it yourself, to be on your own, to not need anyone, to lean into nothing, and to somehow muscle your way through your sorrow. And you can't. It's important to be with my own melancholy from time to time and to really feel into that. But then I need to bring it back out into community, because grief has never been private. Grief has always, in our entire story as a species, been a communal process. So part of what our grief is waiting for is the village to show up. And the village can be small. It can, if we have 2 or 3 people gathered, to sit down and say, tonight, I want to tell you about my sorrow. And I want to hear all about your sorrow. And there's nothing broken. Nothing needs fixing. What we mainly need is to have someone listen deeply to my sorrow and say, it matters. The 5 gates speak to the different tributaries that come into the soul as a consequence of being alive right now in this culture. And we typically only acknowledge the first gate of grief, which is the grief that occurs when someone or something that we love dies or leaves. And that's the only grief that really has any acknowledgement culturally. People will say, I'm sorry for your loss. And that's really the only one that really has a chance of being responded to. And it's also one of the only ones that we acknowledge. The other 4 gates of grief typically aren't even thought of or recognized. The second gate has to do with the loss of something, some part of us that has never known love. We are raised in cultures that really narrow down the parameter of how much we get to inhabit of our own life. So in my family, I was not allowed to keep possession of my anger, my joy, my sensuality, even my exuberance was cut out. So we cleave parts of our psyche, cleave parts of our soul out of our lives, and that's a loss to the integrity of our psyche, to the integrity of our soul. And the proper response to that loss should be grief. But we typically hold these parts of us with judgment and contempt. And we cannot grieve for something that we hold with judgment. So there's this perpetual, ongoing feeling of loss that we never really resolve. The third gate of grief has to do with the losses of the world, the sorrows of the world. Every day we hear about species depletion, the emptying of the oceans, mountaintop removal, or even just the casualties by the roadside. They are our daily litany of loss that we feel on some level. The fourth gate has to do with, it's a little harder to name, but it's the loss we feel around what we expected when we arrived here and did not receive. We are wired for the full experience and encounter that our deep time ancestors had, which was namely tribal or village life on a consistent basis, participation with nature on a consistent basis, rituals to deal with the movement and transitions of life, the losses, the gratitudes, the healing. That's what we expected when we arrived here. We expected to get up in the morning and have 40 pairs of eyes greeting us and saying, "What did you dream last night, John? Tell me your story." And to gather tonight around the fire to hear the old stories. That's what we expected, and almost none of that materialized. So we feel kind of an aching echo in our bodies of what it is that we don't even know to name, but is not there. And the fifth gate of grief is what I call ancestral grief. And this grief has to do with, on many different levels. One of them is simply that at some point our ancestors came from an intact tribal community, someplace. They knew the land, they had the rituals, they had the language, the songs, the food, and they were embedded into that place. And at some point there was a severing of that connection and a move to this continent. Typically that entailed a great deal of loss of traditions, language, and so forth. But the deeper part of this ancestral grief is what happened when our ancestors arrived here, with the destruction of ecosystems, of entire indigenous populations, the advent of slavery. All of these are still weaving their way down the ancestral lineage, and it's still in our bones. It's still in our body. Those are the 5 gates of grief. I think that when we deny grief its full access, and when we compact grief internally, it does generate a lot of rage. My friend Malidoma Some once said, "You cannot trust a man who cannot grieve. He becomes a walking powder keg in the community." So there is this experience of compressed grief leading to some type of explosive quality. And we see that throughout the culture right now, don't we? I mean, the violence that is rampant in terms of gunfire and even the whole military and industrial industry is geared towards that whole expression of unresolved grief. I think Martin Prechtel said that all war is unmetabolized grief. That's a part of anger's life. Anger is much bigger than that. Anger is its own rightful emotion that speaks to boundary and violation and justice and protection. It's a very necessary energy. Jung once said the first impulse to individuation comes through Mars. In other words, the first genuine expression of who I am in this world comes through the god of war. We need that ability to stand. This is where I stand. This is who I am. And I make this declaration. And it comes out of that energy. The thing that we don't typically do is develop it into a martial art. We remain pretty unskilled around Mars, around anger, around that energy. So we need to actually mature that quality. Anger, when it's done well, is a relational process. It is revelatory. I am telling you about me. I am telling you what is upset, what is troubled, what has gotten into my body that is causing me to feel deeply about something. Intimidation is an attempt to silence a relationship. It is meant to push you away from me and to feel frightened of me. So it is a rupture. It is the breaking of a connection rather than a deepening of one. True anger leads to intimacy. It is revelatory, like I tell you. I am telling you something so deep about me. Why I'm angry is because something got to me so much at the heart of who I am. Something I love, something I cherish, something I want to protect has been injured and violated. And so I need to tell you about this so you know me more deeply. Intimidation does just the opposite. It breaks the bond and creates distance and fear. Healthy power, healthy anger is something that serves the greater good, where intimidation tends to serve the narrow interest of either the individual or even the country. we intimidate a lot of countries with our might and our force. But we lose a certain degree of soulfulness in that process of intimidation. Now, our culture suffers from two primary sins: amnesia and anesthesia. We forget and we go numb. And consequently, the brighter, more scintillating world goes unnoticed. And when that world goes dull, we absolutely lean into secondary satisfactions, entertainment, shopping, addictions of all sorts. But even more pernicious is that we begin to lean on power, wealth, status, rank, privilege. And our culture becomes, by extension, a carrier of secondary satisfactions around empire. Empire is probably one of the most egregious expressions of secondary satisfaction. We always want more. There's no such thing as satisfaction in this culture. We are designed to be unsatisfied chronically by this culture. So we're always hungry for the next thing that comes. And that's, to me, is one of our deepest sources of grief, is that we're never fed true nutrition. I remember speaking to a client of mine one time, and I was describing how we are so used to secondary satisfactions are like drinking sugar and eating dust. And he said, and I started describing the primary satisfactions, he went, protein. I said, yes, that's what sustains us. That's what really gives us a feeling of satisfaction at the soul level. These are the things that the soul absolutely requires to feel alive, to feel engaged in our life. Necessary touch, laughter, condolences and kindnesses in times of sorrow, shared meals, starlit nights that we sit together and tell stories, rituals that mend and tend the whole of our relationships to each other and to the green world around us and to the sacred world. Those are the things that we absolutely require. Otherwise, we are scrambling and trying to fill the hole with whatever we can, and we never achieve the end. If you ask any addict, the more you use the substance, the more you want it. It's as if secondary satisfactions tend to exaggerate their own symptom over time. We want more, and we want more, and we finally die as a consequence of that addiction. And the other thing I want to just say is that we've only talked about one hand of the prayer. One hand is grief, the other is gratitude. And we need both to sustain this life. A mature man, a mature woman knows how to carry grief in one hand and gratitude in the other. And when those two are together, now we're in the prayer of life.